In this episode, I'm exploring the question, do I need a break? Whether it's a vacation, a relationship break, or even a pause in therapy, we're going to look at what we're actually seeking when we want distance. I'm going to unpack when breaks are restorative, when they're avoidant, and how to understand the deeper emotional dynamics underneath the urge to step away. So let's get into it. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast that brings nuance to popular psych and offers you help beyond self-help. I am Thaís Sky. I'm a licensed psychotherapist here in the state of California and your host on Reclaim. After a decade in the wellness world as a yoga teacher and somatic coach, I became disillusioned with the approaches that keep people on a self-improvement treadmill without addressing the deeper patterns. That's what led me to clinical psychology. That's what led me to study psychoanalytic psychotherapy, because real lasting change requires more than behavioral fixes. So if you're a tender-hearted human craving substance, complexity, and a more honest look at the human experience, you're in the right place. That's what we're here to do together, and I'm so thrilled that you are here. It's been a minute since I released a new podcast episode, and I've been thinking a lot about the podcast. My podcast is always on my mind. I'm always thinking about it and what I want to talk about, and yet I haven't had the time to record an episode. And then I went on vacation. And when I came back and I've been thinking about what topics I want to share with you, I started thinking about breaks. Why do we need breaks? I know that we may understand that on the one hand, like we all need breaks and breaks are good for us. And it's good to have space and distance sometimes. But I've been more curious, like, what is the psychological underpinning that drives our desire for breaks? And why is it that sometimes that desire for break is actually going to cause more damage or actually gets in the way of the things that we want? It's a confusing thing, right? The ways in which we sabotage or get in the way of the things that we want. And I think breaks can play such a crucial role in that. And so that's what I want to talk about. Let's talk about, when are breaks helpful? When are they not? And how can we discern? How can we figure out what we really need? Because the more that we can figure out what we really need, the more likely we'll be able to meet that need. And so, yes, it's completely understandable that we need breaks, right? And when we're saying that I need a break from work or from therapy or from my partner, a break from my life, oftentimes what we're trying to communicate is that we are feeling overwhelmed, that we are feeling depleted, that we're feeling burnt out, right? We're feeling irritated. We're feeling maybe emotionally saturated. We're feeling like it's just all too much, and we need a reprieve. We need a break. And we fantasize that maybe distance is actually what's going to offer the relief from the intensity. I saw this great TikTok of the caption said, like, you don't need therapy, you just need Italy. And it was this beautiful TikTok of this person traveling in Italy. And I love the TikTok because it communicates exactly this fantasy of, like, we don't need to deal with the stuff of our lives. We just need a break. And if we can go on a break somewhere beautiful like Italy, that's going to repair and restore all of the kind of burnt out feelings that we're having, right? That's going to give us the courage to face our lives. The problem is that we've done that, right? We've taken that type of a break. We've gone to beautiful places, or we have tried to take a break from a relationship, or we have said to ourselves, like, oh, I need to take a break from this. And what we then often experience isn't reprieve. It doesn't feel like it really lands or creates the real shifts that we wanted it to create. And so sometimes the wish for a break is not really about rest. And when we can understand what may be really going on, what we may be really wanting, it can help us decide if a break is truly going to be helpful or not. So the question is, what are we really seeking when we say, I need a break? Now, I have some ideas to start us off of what may we really be seeking. One idea is what we may be wanting is relief from overstimulation. We may be feeling like there's too much demand for our time, our energy. We're feeling too much emotional intensity. We're feeling too much relational activation, right? I see this sometimes in therapy when somebody wants a break suddenly. Right when the sessions start to intensify, we start touching on something really vulnerable. Now, the way that they often justify that, because we always find ways to justify it, the things that we say that we need on some level, is, oh, I've just gotten really busy, or, you know what, I suddenly have another financial obligation that's more important, or, I really just need a break because this is all too intense for me right now. But on the other hand, the other level, what I try to listen for beneath that is what may be going on internally for us that we are wanting some distance. That maybe what we're also saying in those moments of like, I need a break when we're touching on very vulnerable things is that this is emotionally activating in ways I don't yet have words for. And it's interesting. Oftentimes, when a patient says that I need a break, it is around that time that I'm actually wondering if they could benefit from meeting more often, meeting more than once a week. Now, I work psychoanalytically, which means I understand that more contact in a week can actually help us feel more supported and more grounded and more capable of going into more vulnerable parts of ourselves. And so I don't think as increasing session frequency just for patients who are in crisis or who need more concrete help. In fact, I often find that it's people who aren't in crisis, but who are wanting more emotional depth in their life, who are feeling so burnt out, feeling so isolated and alone, that could actually benefit from meeting more often. So it's interesting, right? That sometimes I start imagining, oh, I wonder if this person could be helped better, would be better served if we meet more often. And they're coming to me saying, actually, I want a break. And it's like, what's going on in that disconnection between my fantasy and their fantasy? And yes, there could obviously be ways in which I'm not understanding or I'm not really attuned to what they're saying. But there's also ways in which sometimes I find that when our work gets too intense or very intense, and then you are going a whole week without another session, it's too much time that goes by where you're left alone to try to make sense of all that's getting stirred up. And that if we were to meet more often, instead of it becoming even more intense, it would actually alleviate some intensity. But that goes against, I think, so much of our thinking about this. And it's one of the reasons why I really wanted to record this podcast episode is that we often think if it's too intense, the only course of action that we have is to decrease the intensity by creating distance. And I'm just here to suggest that sometimes that is true. And sometimes if we want to alleviate intensity, what's actually better for us, what's actually going to create more relief for us is to lean in a little bit more. Okay, so back to maybe what we're actually seeking when we're wanting a break. So one, we may be needing some sort of reprieve from overstimulation, right? Too much stimulation. The next idea of why we may be wanting a break is we want to escape the ambivalence, the conflicting feelings that are coming up for us. I talk about ambivalence a lot on the podcast because I think it's a really central, not only idea in psychoanalysis, but in our lives, the ways in which we are conflicted. We want and don't want. This is a really important concept to learn about ourselves because so often we feel like, well, but I just want to be in a relationship. And yet we're not doing anything to, let's see, put ourselves out there and start dating. What's going on there? Well, probably because while you are in touch with your desire to be in a relationship, you may not be as in touch with your fears around it, your conflicting thoughts about it. And so that's just getting acted out in the ways in which you're not dating, right? This happens to all of us. We all do this. And so sometimes a break is a way that we're trying to escape from these conflicting, often unconscious experiences that we're having, particularly when we're wanting a break from a relationship. Right? Because we want and we resist the same thing. So there may be ways in which closeness and distance can actually coexist. And so when we're saying, I need a break from my partner, what we may be actually really conflicted about is the ways in which we really want closeness, but we resent needing them, or we feel disappointed that they can't meet our needs perfectly. And so we're conflicted about it. And we try to then alleviate the conflict, move away from the conflict by going on a break, by breaking up the contact with the conflict. And this becomes a way of trying to manage all of the feelings that the ambivalence is stirring up. Another reason why we may be seeking a break is because we're wanting a kind of psychic quietness. this, Not everything is avoidance. And I'm certainly not I hope I'm not kind of communicating in this episode that a break is like always avoidance or always bad. Sometimes the psyche genuinely needs space to metabolize, time to think, less relational intensity. Sometimes we need a moment in a conflict with our partner when we're so stimulated and aroused and dysregulated. It may be the best thing that we can do for ourselves and for the relationship to say, I need a moment. I need to take a beat. I can't think straight. And I'm saying things I'm regretting. I'm saying things I don't mean. I'm experiencing very intense emotions towards you right now that I don't think are going to be healthy for me to be acting on. I need to take a beat. I need to take a walk. I need to take a moment. Sometimes that distance can create a psychic quietness for us to then find, how are we really thinking about this? How are we really understanding this? Where may I be understanding something about the situation that I'm acting on that maybe isn't really what's happening, right? It creates some space for us to think. And that can be really restorative. So of course, in that way, quietness or reprieve can be restorative, but it can also be defensive. And we see this when we say we need a break. We take a break, we go walk, we take a walk, and then we come back hotter than ever, more entrenched in our anger than ever, right? The risk of a break is that it pauses the conversation at a time of intensity and a time of, it's like it freezes the scene. And now you're reliving the frozen scene without the opportunity to see that scene through. And I've talked a little bit about this in my episode on embarrassment, where I painted a scenario of, let's say you fell down a set of stairs. You weren't hurt, but it was embarrassing because it happened in front of people, and you looked up and everyone was laughing at you. And you immediately leave the scene. And now that moment replays in your head over and over and over again. And you continue to feel really mortified by it. You continue to feel really embarrassed by that. That embarrassment, that experience is now frozen in mind. There's no conclusion. There's no resolution to that. Versus if you had stayed, maybe you would have noticed that the people weren't laughing at you. They were laughing at something happening at the top of the stairs. Or that they weren't laughing because they were laughing at you, but they were laughing at maybe their own experience of having fallen and their own reverie of their, of what happened to them before. Or, if you were to stick around, you were able to laugh together and realize the insanity of what just happened and how funny it actually was, right? There's so many different ways that if you had stayed in it, the scene would have evolved. You would have gotten more information. Maybe something would have gotten worked through. Something would have been explored more deeply. But the problem with taking breaks in moments of intensity is that it can sometimes freeze the scene. So then we're like just stewing, right? And we're just getting more and more entrenched in our anger, more and more resolute that we're right and you're wrong. And how could you have done this? And it doesn't then allow anything to get really worked through in the break. You come back hotter than ever. And the other person may be like, wait, I thought we were taking a moment of respite, a moment of break. How is it that you're coming in hotter than ever? Maybe because that break didn't actually serve for you as a psychic quietness, but actually as a way that you continue to stay overly stimulated by the conflict. So those are just a couple of reasons for why we may need a break, right? And it's like a full range of different desires that we're having in our break. But I think it's also useful to talk about there are also different types of breaks, and there's different psychological meanings to different types of breaks, right? There's the type of break that I'm talking about with the TikTok to Italy, which is the vacation break, right? The time off. I haven't been on social media for like a month now. And, it's this sense of like, I need to reset. I need to step back. It's a temporary removal, right, from psychic demands, right? And we can, in a break, in a vacation, we can have a fantasy of a self without responsibility. And there can be this alleviation of anxiety and the weight of responsibility. And we can breathe a little deeper and get to experience ourselves a little bit deeper in a different way. It can really offer a kind of reclaiming of autonomy, a break, a vacation, whether it's a weekend getaway, whether it's an afternoon where you go on a hike and leave your phone at home, right? I'm not even talking about needing to go to Italy. But any type of break, psychic separation, where we're not thinking about what's happening at home, we're not kind of consumed by responsibilities, can offer a reclamation of our autonomy. It can give us a little bit more breathing room. And if a vacation helps briefly, right? If you go to Italy and you feel really good, but then the dread immediately returns when you come home, the issue then there may not be the burnout alone, but how one is living relationally and internally, right? Like if you go on a vacation, you go back, you have a good time, you come back, and like it didn't feel like it shifted anything internally for you. You're like right back as if the break didn't happen. Then maybe it wasn't really about the break. And maybe it's really about how you're living your life right now that warrants some deeper exploration and confrontation, right? Maybe there's something about how your life looks that just isn't working for you. So we can see this often in people who just take a lot of trips, right? Very frequent trips. They're traveling all the time. And we look at their lives and we wonder, like, what are they running away from? Like, why do they have to go on these they have to be constantly moving? We can also see this in people who they feel relief, right, while they go away, but then they come back to some relational resentment or some over-functioning patterns. So again, that's an example of like, the break isn't going to actually do what you want it to do longer term. Maybe it's about reevaluating how you're organizing your life so that the vacation can still feel good, but maybe your life can also feel good too, right? Because like back to that TikTok, we can appreciate the reprieve that Italy could offer, experiencing a new culture, experiencing new foods, getting to see new things, and how good that can be for us. But if we think that that is going to replace the function of therapy, of taking time in your life to make sure your life is working the way you want it to work, well, then that's a false equivalence. We're misunderstanding the function, the role that breaks can play for us. Now, another type of break, and one that I think is the most kind of psychologically loaded, right, are relationship breaks. And gosh, these are tricky ones. Are you the type of person that often asks your partner, like, we need a break? Are you in that type of relationship right now where you're constantly going on a break and coming back together and going on a break or coming back together? There are so many unconscious meanings for why we may want to take a break from our partner or are finding ourselves in a relationship where we are constantly going on breaks and coming back together. One thing that we may be unconsciously doing is we're kind of testing the bond. We're trying to see, like, will they chase me? Well, are they really listening to how upset I am? Do they really care about me? So I'm going to go on a break to see how much they care about me, right? That could be one kind of unconscious driver of wanting a relationship break. We could be trying to regulate disappointment. If I am so disappointed about the relationship that I feel like it's just absolutely unbearable, then maybe I go on a break to try to distance myself from some of that disappointment. Right. So it's a way that we're trying to titrate or manage our feelings about the relationship and the disappointment. We may want to break to avoid confrontation because we're not really talking about what matters or what needs to change or what's not working. And so the only way you know how to try to take your own needs seriously is by going on a break rather than confronting the problem in the relationship. There could be ways in which we're creating a break because we're wanting to distance ourselves from dependency needs. We're terrified of depending on somebody. We're terrified of the vulnerability that comes with dependency, of really leaning on people, really relying on people. And so we take a break to try to distance ourselves from those needs. I see this often also in my psychotherapy practice. Where, somebody will say to me, well, I'm not supposed to be in therapy forever, right? So I need a break. I need to see how I can do without therapy because I'm not meant to be in therapy forever. That's not what we're here to do. I don't want to be too dependent on you. Now, there's so much interesting intrapsychic conflicts that often is happening for that individual. And on the one hand, as a psychotherapist, and as I'm hoping to make clear in this episode, I definitely see breaks as potentially regenerative and useful and filled with information that we may not know without a break. And so I definitely do think that there can be a time and a place for a break in therapy or an ending of therapy or a time in your life where you're not in therapy. And I'm also listening to something else that the patient may be communicating to me in those moments around what it means for them to really depend on me, what it means for them to imagine that they could lean on me longer term, and how terrifying that could be for some people, especially those of us who really struggle with depending, who have learned to be overly self-reliant, who have really learned that depending on people is very dangerous. They're not reliable. They can't actually be leaned on. We learned that we don't actually need that then. We've learned to live without it. But good therapy is going to invite us into deeper curiosity about that, because oftentimes being overly reliant or overly independent is actually a way that we then make it impossible to experience a type of closeness and intimacy that we are craving in our intimate partnerships. And therapy is a way to try to work through some of those relational deficits from our past to make it so that we can have more of the types of relationships we want in our present and our future. And so when somebody says, I need a break because I want to see how I can do without you because I'm scared to depend on you, right? I'm listening for not only the kind of adult competent part of them that's wanting to try something new, but I'm also listening for the kind of deeper fear and anxieties around how they're relating to me, and trying to think about, can we slow down a bit here and help us understand what may be going on over here, so that again, this break can actually be useful for you rather than just a reenacting or something, a pattern going again and again and again. Yes. So we often, I think, want a break from our partnership as a way to try to manage our dependency needs. And, I gotta say, a break in a relationship, whether it's a therapy relationship, an intimate partnership, going no contact with a parent, it's rarely neutral. It is very rarely that it doesn't evoke quite a lot of emotions. It really reorganizes the emotional field when we are asking for a break. And if this is the first time that maybe we're in an intimate partnership and we're asking for a break, that break can actually signal and create long-lasting impact on the relationship. When a partner says to us, like, I need space, it can underneath, right? It can be a fear of engulfment and a fear of abandonment and a fear of their dependency. It can mean all these things, but now it's getting acted out in the relationship. And you, as the recipient, may now start to struggle with trust and how do I know this isn't going to happen again? And how long of a space you need? And what about my relationship needs? And what about my desires? And what if they're conflicting to this desire for a break, right? So the break, while it tries to become a compromise between closeness and escape, instead of I want to leave the relationship, I just want to take a break, it can also now deteriorate the foundation of the relationship if not done thoughtfully, with care, and with a lot of communication. Okay, so that's relationship breaks. And then, of course, the other type of breaks that I'm thinking about in this episode are therapy breaks. I've been saying this is an especially rich opportunity because there's so much meaning of why a client may want to break from therapy, right? There could be feelings of overstimulation, like too much emotional material emerging. It could be resistance to something and like a realization that I don't really want to look at that thing anyway, right? There could be a need for autonomy, for a sense of like, you see me as an adult, right? You see me as competent, right? And I'm going to assert my autonomy and my sovereignty by saying that I can take a break from you or exercising that function. It can feel very important for those of us who have felt engulfed or felt trapped to be able to feel like we can take a break or we can terminate something should we want it. And it's very interesting how often we so quickly feel trapped in something despite the other person being completely available for you leaving, right? We often feel like we are staying in it for them and not for us. And if that's happening in therapy, that's very meaningful and important to look at. And of course, there could also be fear of dependency, which we talked a little bit about. There could be anger towards the therapist that can't be expressed yet. Gosh, this happens. We have a session where I missed something. I got something wrong. I said something that did not land. there was a rupture of some kind, and the very next session or via email, the client is like, you know what, I want a break. And my invitation always is, well, can we at least talk about it? Because I'm very curious what happened. And I can appreciate at the same time that it takes a lot for us to tell somebody that they hurt us, to tell somebody that there was a miss, to tell somebody that we had wanted something and they didn't give us that. And it's actually, though, however, as hard as it is, this is what therapy is for. This is the opportunity that we have in a relationship, like with our therapist, is to try to practice some of these skills that are incredibly important for the types of relationships that we want to have. So if I were to just, immediately respect the break, right, I may be missing on an opportunity to support my client, make sense of their anger, make sense of their resentment towards me, or a whole slew of other feelings. And so as a therapist, I'm, again, always trying to think on multiple levels, respecting the autonomy of the person in front of me, as well as trying to do my job, which is, you brought me on to help you understand something more meaningful about your life and why your life is the way that it is. And I want to be able to offer the space for us to explore those things. And it's always a tension. I don't always get it right, but that's how I'm thinking about it. So much of, I think, what we want in our intimate partnerships and also what we want in our therapy is we want to be held as the competent, capable adult and also as the wounded, little, vulnerable child. And as I know so many of us have experienced that intimate partnerships, it's hard sometimes to hold both at the exact same time. Sometimes we need to hold one, sometimes we need to hold the other, but it makes a lot of sense that we have this desire for both things to be held and for it to feel like they're held at the same time, in the same way, equally. But anyway, that's the kind of benefit of being in a more longer term type therapy, is that we get to experience all of these ruptures and repairs together. And if we are conflict avoidant and if we are terrified of conflict, it makes a lot of sense that we want to go on a break to try to distance ourselves from it. But there's then a missed opportunity to learn how to be better in conflict and to learn that actually conflict and ruptures and repairs are a healthy and necessary part of relationships. And of course, just to make it clear, not all therapy breaks are defensive or are a problem. Some of them are real metabolizing pauses. Sometimes we don't really know what we're getting until we're not getting it for a while. Sometimes it takes us to go away from something, to miss it, and to realize the preciousness of it. And so sometimes that happens in therapy. Sometimes we take a break, we come back, and it feels like it was really regenerative. And so I'm making space for that too. I'm trying to listen for that too. Is this break going to be what you want it to be, right? Or is this going to be a reenactment, a kind of a pattern playing out again and again? And so that leads me to kind of the next section of like, okay, so Thaís, you're telling me that breaks are helpful, but I'm not hearing you talk about how breaks are helpful. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about when a break is helpful, right? A break may be growth supportive or helpful when it's conscious. It's not reactive. It's not coming from ooh, you said that one thing that hurt me. I need to take a break. It's coming more from, I've been doing a lot of thinking and we've been talking a lot about this, and I think it could be useful for me to temporarily take a break, right? A break can be helpful if it includes reflection rather than total avoidance. So I need a break from this friendship, but in the meantime, while you're taking that break, you're reflecting on it. You're really thinking about it. And I'm going to talk a little bit later of like, how do we make breaks useful, regardless of why you took the break. Let's say you took a break out of a reactivity or whatever, but now you're in it. How do we make the most of it? We'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, so we want to use breaks to be reflective instead of like, I don't want to talk to my friend right now, and I don't even want to think about her. I don't want to even touch that with a 10-foot pole. That may be more indicative of a potential avoidance. And with avoidance comes, unfortunately, not a lot of working through, not a lot of resolution internally or in the relationship, right? Sometimes breaks can be really regenerative when it creates space for integration. I often think about when we've injured ourselves and how important it is for us to take a break from using that muscle or using that ligament, using whatever we've injured, I actually, now as I'm now thinking about it, I think that metaphor is so apt. I actually wrote an email newsletter a while ago about my foot fracture. I fractured my foot last March, and for the first 6 weeks, my podiatrist gave me a boot and told me I have to be very careful and to try to stay off of it. And then after whatever it was, 6 weeks, I went back to him saying, "Hey, it's still hurting." And he goes, "Yeah, but the bone now has healed. So it's actually, as much as it is still hurting, now it's time to actually walk on it." And for a while, I didn't believe him. And I really thought, no, I have to stay off of it. And I was very tender with it and avoidant of facing the discomfort necessary to walk again, to put weight on my foot again. But then I went on a trip where we had to do a lot of steps. And as much as I tried to mitigate some of that and not do too much walking, we still ended up doing a lot of walking. And by the end of that trip, my foot was almost like completely healed. And it's really interesting where like the break part, the not using the foot was important to let the bone heal, but then there was an amount of healing that comes with confronting it and using it and facing it, and that I actually wouldn't get better fully if I didn't learn to put weight on my foot again. And I think that speaks a lot to this episode, exactly what I'm trying to say here. Sometimes a break is really necessary. It's regenerative. It's a way that we try to tend to ourselves. But then we are eventually going to have to do the work of trying to figure out why we needed a break in the first place and repair and face whatever it is that's happening in our lives that we're overstimulated by or overwhelmed by, or else that break is not going to do what we want it to do, you know? The other way a break can be really helpful is when it is discussed rather than abruptly enacted. And this, comes up again, like I've been saying in therapy. There's a massive difference between when a client comes and says, I've been thinking about this. I don't know. Can you help me think about this together? And then we ultimately decide that, yeah, a break I think is going to be really beneficial for that person. I think that, they think that, we've worked through it, we've talked about it, and they've decided that. Or even if we've talked about it and there's a little dubiousness of whether the break could or could not be helpful, it was still felt like it was something that we explored together, rather than, there's a difference between that and someone emailing me right after a session and saying, I need a break. Those are usually two different types of breaks, and they're going to be experienced very differently by those people. Again, there's no right, there's no wrong, and this isn't about me or taking care of me as a therapist, but this is about, well, if you are trying to like change things about yourself and you are finding yourself doing the same thing in therapy that you're doing in your life, then maybe there's an opportunity there to look at that, and to let this person that you've hired to help you look at that, then look at that together. And so, a reflective break often deepens awareness, and an impulsive break often interrupts a meaningful process in the middle of something. Like that example of the embarrassing fall, right? If you're in the middle of something, a break is probably not going to offer not a long-term break, right? There's a difference between taking a 10-minute break while you're in the middle of a fight versus taking a 2-month break after, in the middle of a fight with a friend. It's just different experiences. And, it could be an opportunity for you to reflect, right? Like, when have you experienced a break and it felt regenerative, and what was different about it versus a break that wasn't regenerative or didn't lead to what you wanted? Take a moment to see, like, what was the difference for you? What did you notice? And of course, when needing a break might be coming out of a wounded or a defensive place, so signs to explore that may be true is if the urge appears right at a moment of intimacy, right, of either real intimacy of closeness, or a lot of, overwhelming feelings, right? Notice if it repeats across relationships and settings, right? Like I said, if it's happening in therapy and happening in all of your relationships, that's important to know. And if relief is short-lived, as I've been saying. And it's helpful to sometimes think that, while, that sometimes a break that we're saying is about the other person is not from the other person. That's not what we're actually wanting a break from. It's from the feelings that they evoke in us. And sometimes what we need is a break, a separation to help understand and metabolize the feelings that are getting evoked. And sometimes what we actually need is to get closer, more contact, more talking about this, more support, so we can expand our capacity to tolerate the feelings that are getting evoked. So some alternatives to taking a break to increase the likelihood that you actually get more of what you really need, right, is to try to name the experience in real time. So instead of withdrawing in a conflict, try to say something like, I feel really overwhelmed right now, or I'm noticing myself wanting to shut down, or I'm realizing that if I don't take a 5-minute break, that I'm going to say something I'm going to regret. And what we're doing in these moments is we're attempting to slow down resentment and to increase intimacy without necessarily letting them more into our feelings, right? So we're creating a little bit of a distance while also maintaining closeness by saying, hey, I'm noticing I really want to shut down right now. I'm not doing it, but that's what I'm noticing. And then that will give the other person an opportunity to then give you more of what you want, which is to step away from what they're saying, or to attend to you, or to slow them down a little bit and their emotions, right? And that increases then the likelihood that you actually get more of what it is that you want. Another alternative to taking a break is to adjust the stimulation, right? Instead of the full withdrawal. So instead of removing oneself completely, I need a break from this relationship, we could say, I need a break for 24 hours. I need to take away for just a beat. I need to pause us here. Can we get back to this tomorrow afternoon, right? So that decreases the intensity, but it doesn't cut off the contact and leave you then feeling really alone. Because that's often what happens when we take a break is, yes, there's ways in which it could create psychic quietness, but it could also evoke more terror of abandonment, of loss, of termination, of endings. And then that may actually make everything feel a lot worse, right? You could try saying to your therapist, hey, I'm noticing every time I end session that I'm left feeling really overwhelmed in my life and I'm having a really hard time knowing how to make sense of all this. Talking about this, talking about the intensity of it, instead of feeling like you just have to metabolize it by yourself or remove yourself completely from it, can be a way that we're building your capacity and letting you feel more supported in the overwhelm. So you could also try to shorten the conversations. Instead of a 3-hour conflict with your partner, what if we were to have it an hour and then we will touch back tomorrow about this, right? Instead of total silence, instead of I can't do this anymore and then just leaving. A few more alternatives to taking a break. And this is something that I briefly mentioned before, right? Increasing our tolerance for ambivalence, because intimacy requires actually the capacity to hold mixed feelings, that you can love someone and feel irritated, that you can value therapy and want to avoid it, that you can want rest, need rest, and still care about your commitments. And so expanding your capacity to tolerate ambivalence, to be able to say to your therapist, oh my God, I don't want to be here right now, can be so useful, rather than feeling like you have to just tolerate it by yourself or, just avoid it completely, distance yourself from it completely. And then another alternative to taking a break is, you can, instead of just immediately taking the break, you can reflect on what am I hoping that the break will give me, and will it give me relief, control? Is it really about safety? Is it about recognition? Is it about emotional space? Like what am I really hoping that the break will give me? And then is there a way that we can then get that directly, right? Rather than through distance. If you're wanting to feel more in control, if you're wanting to feel more powerful, well, how are ways that we can help you create that? That's not then going on a break, which may or may not give that to you. Let's say, regardless of why you chose to go on a break, let's say that you did. Sometimes breaks are good, sometimes they're not so great. But let's see, regardless of why, can we still get some good? Can we get something out of this break? Can we make the most out of this break? Also, you don't have to make the most out of a break. I resent this idea that we always have to be growing. We always have to be working on ourselves. have to be motivated. I mean, that feels so pop psych and that feels so boring to me. You don't always have to be the bigger person. You don't always have to be perfect. I mean, it's just it leads, I think, to this like kind of ways in which we then get to feel morally superior from people, or that we get to then imagine that if we always growing and learning, that nothing bad can ever happen. And I resent that. I don't agree with that. Sometimes a break can just be a break for whatever reason. It is what it is. However, let's talk about how to make the most out of a break instead of just escaping. Yes. Okay. Because sometimes breaks are necessary. And so how do we make it psychologically useful? The first thing is to clarify what you're actually taking a break from. Before the break, you can ask, am I taking a break from a person, from a responsibility, from disappointment, from stimulation? Like, what is going on here? Because while many people are wanting a break from a situation, what they're actually, like I said before, are seeking a break or relief from the emotions that that situation evokes. So if somebody says they need a break from their partner, what they may not be able to really tolerate is the feelings of being unseen or feeling needy or feeling angry and guilty at the same time. So without that clarity, the break can often become a displacement rather than insight. And maybe knowing that, okay, yeah, I'm taking a break from this because I can't bear these feelings. It's like, that's okay. And why? What do we think it is about these feelings that make it hard to bear? How can we enroll the people in our lives to help us bear this a little bit more? Okay, so how do we make the most out of a break? We can try to be more consciously aware of what fantasies we're having about the break. Because every break carries some sort of fantasy, right? Some type of like, I feel like I'm going to be more myself again. I'm not going to be so overwhelmed. Things will be clearer. The problem will feel smaller, right? And, we can then ask ourselves, what am I imagining that this break is going to fix? Because sometimes the fantasy of it is less pressures, less intimacy, less emotional exposure. And that's important for us to know about ourselves. Is like, what's the fantasy? What's driving this? What are we wanting in this? And is a break really going to offer that to us? And okay, other ways that we can make the most out of a break. Sometimes we think that a break requires total separation, but maybe there's ways that we could stay psychologically in contact even while physically stepping back, and that may be actually a better way for you to get more of what you want out of your break. So a break doesn't have to be a complete emotional withdrawal. We could instead say, hey, this topic is really challenging for us to talk about without conflicts. So can we take a break from talking about this thing for a while? Or can we go to couples therapy to get support around this thing? Or can we make a commitment at 10 a.m. on Monday to talk about this thing together? But I can't just be in the ambiguity of this thing between us. I really would like to take a break from this topic, right? That's a way that we're creating a bit of psychic space without necessarily needing to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Another way that we can stay kind of psychologically in contact, while physically stepping back, is we take time to reflect on it. We take time to journal about what is being felt, what's happening, right? We're kind of reflecting on our recurrent patterns. We're really engaging in an exploration and curiosity about the break and what we hope and blah, 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 rather than just completely go into it and avoid and use the break as a full avoidance tactic. Because if a break is used only to numb and distract, it really interrupts the kind of psychological process that you are actually in the middle of, rather than, and that could be a real miss. Okay, so then a really great way to make the most out of your break is to notice what happens in separation, because breaks are separation, and breaks can bring up a lot of feelings for us around abandonment, loss, endings, terminations. And that's because the unconscious generally can't differentiate between I'm taking a break and this is ending. And so notice what happens and what emerges in the absence, because breaks are very rich. Do you feel relief? Do you feel guilt? Do you feel emptiness? Do you feel anxiety? Do you miss the person, or do you miss just the kind of the regulation that they provided? Does your mind get quieter or does it get louder? right? So, an example of this is like a patient who takes a break from therapy expecting relief, but instead they feel more self-critical thoughts. They find themselves ruminating even more. They find themselves just becoming even more anxious. This reveals that therapy was containing more than they realized, and we couldn't have known that until there was a bit of an absence. That's why therapists going on vacation, going on breaks can be tremendously useful for the treatment because, like I said before, breaks can stir up a lot of feelings about being left, about being abandoned, about being separate from somebody. And so a therapist going on a vacation break gives us an opportunity to then notice, wow, what's it like in the 2 weeks that they're gone? Am I noticing myself say, oh, good, I don't even need them. I don't even miss them. Do we not even notice them gone in our lives? That's interesting, right? Versus maybe feeling like we can't navigate, we can't work, like we can't think, like everything's feeling so overwhelming because we don't have therapy. That's also very rich information, all of which I hope that you can talk about with your therapist because it tells us a lot about how you're experiencing breaks that can then help us, help you kind of work through some of the relational deficits that are coming up around the break. So, like I said, breaks can be very generative for that reason. And so, another way that we can make use of breaks is to really study our patterns. Can we think about like what was becoming too much? What did I feel right before I wanted the distance? Right before I need a break in that moment of reactivity, what was the partner saying? What was happening? What were you experiencing? Maybe you were imagining that they were about to say they wanted a break and you were like, well, I want a break before you get a break. I'm going to leave you before you leave me, right? Or maybe you were noticing that that person wanted to move closer to you. They wanted more from you and you started feeling impinged, engulfed, and you're like, oh my God, I can't do this. You're asking too much from me. And so like, I need a break as a way to move away from the intensity of their feelings towards you because of our ambivalence about closeness, right? So, did the urge to take a break come up? Does it come up in multiple areas of your life, or does it just come up in certain moments? And what are those moments? Right. So, repeated breaks across relationships, across work, across therapy often signal a difficulty tolerating some type of sustained emotional engagement. That knowledge can help us a bit then to know what we want to work on. Another way to make breaks more useful is to set a frame because that type of containment matters. Unbounded breaks can become real avoidant disappearances, especially in intimate partnerships. So to try to be really thoughtful of the impact that you saying you want to break is going to have on the relationship, one of the best ways that we can kind of respect the other person and respect our desire for a break is to have it be time limited. Hey, I need a break for an hour from this is much kinder than saying I want a break and to never give the other person any sense of when you're going to be back. Because you can know that. You can be like, oh, I'm going to go back to them in an hour. But if they don't know that, how are they supposed to know that? The people around us aren't mind readers, right? So having explicit conversations about wanting a break and how you imagine that break is going to go can also be a way to contain some of the feelings that get generated when you decide that you want a break. And naming intentions can truly change the quality of the break rather than abruptly withdrawing. So, saying something, I need 2 weeks to decompress and to think, not to avoid you, can go a long way in helping preserve the relational bond while still creating space. So we can say something like, I know you're going to experience this as punishment, but I promise you that's not where this is coming from. I don't want to punish you. I really do just need a few hours to myself so I can think about this more deeply and come back to you in a way that's actually going to be kinder. Saying all that can actually go a long way than just being like, I need a break, and then leaving the other person to wonder, like, are you coming back? And what does this mean? And are you punishing me? Because if you don't kind of be thoughtful about the impact that a break is going to have in the relationships that matter, you are then in some ways using the break as a form of aggression, hoping though that the other person's going to tolerate it. But you yourself are saying that you can't tolerate something that's coming up. And so that's kind of wild, right? That you want the other person to be able to tolerate something that you yourself are not able to tolerate. So if you are wanting a break in the middle of a conversation to respect yourself and your autonomy, by all means, but the invitation is, can we also make it so that when you come back, that break will have been for something rather than coming back and now having to deal with this absolute combustion of a conversation that's going to then make you feel like the break was not useful for you. Okay, so how to make a break more useful, we can also engage in like, well, what would actually maybe regulate you more than just distance? Is it a slower pacing? Is it more communication? Is it more emotional validation? Is it more boundaries? Is it more rest within the relationship, not outside of it? A break is often a kind of a global solution to a very specific unmet need. And like I said before, you can try to just go on a break and hope that it gets that need met, or you can get that need met more directly. And that probably will feel so much better for you. And then, of course, returning from a break. You've taken the break for whatever reason. It felt what had to happen. You're now coming back from the break. Now, how someone returns tells us a lot more in some ways than the break itself. What did you learn about yourself from the break? What core issues changed or just paused? What felt different in the absence? And how do you come back from a break? Do you come back from a break feeling guilty, feeling bad? Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Do you feel like entitled? Like, I should have done that and you shouldn't have any feelings about it, right? I'm talking more about relational breaks. I'm not necessarily talking about like work breaks here. Vacation breaks, I think, are a little different. I think Americans tend to really not take our work breaks for a variety of cultural reasons that I think requires a little bit of confronting. But in terms of relational breaks, if nothing is understood for why you wanted the break and what you hope to get from it, then the psyche often recreates the same tension that made the break feel necessary in the first place, right? And so we need to kind of invite a little bit more reflection there so that the break actually could do something that you wanted it to do. A real meaningful break is meant to increase awareness, not just reduce discomfort. And it's really important that we know that difference. That discomfort, like walking with my healed foot that didn't feel healed, is actually necessary for me to grow. We have to be able to learn how to discern some of that. And the only way that we can do it is by engaging in conversations with ourselves and other people around it. In some ways, when we're talking about relationships, I think it's less interesting to ask, do I need a break? And I think it's more interesting to ask, what is happening inside of me that makes distance feel like the only form of relief right now? And I think that that shifts a little bit from like avoidance to more of a psychological curiosity, and that's where the real kind of change can take place. The other kind of important facet of this conversation as we're getting towards the end of our conversation here today, sometimes we're saying, I need a break, but what we're really scared of saying is, I need this to end. This happens again. As a psychotherapist, I see this happen where a patient is actually really wanting to end our work, but is scared to say that to me, is scared to end it. And so they disguise it as wanting a break. And then I never hear from them again. And, that's not to say that they won't ever come back. But what that does is it deprives us of an opportunity to actually end something intentionally by having like a termination process, an ending process, a way of saying goodbye. And hey, this really meant something for this period of time. And let's review like what you learned and what it's like to be ending this with me. And how do you imagine that's going to go? And how can we support, like there's all sorts of conversations that we're depriving ourselves of when we are kind of disguising our desire for an ending with this sense of like, I want to break. Sometimes we feel like that's a kind thing that we're doing for the other person. Instead of saying, I want to break up with you, I want to break. But it's not very kind if you're leading somebody on to think that they're going to hear back from you and then you ghost them or then you end things with them. It's actually a lot more kinder to be more clear and to get to understand something of yourself. Why are you afraid of it ending? What is it getting evoked for you to think about ending this that feels more easier to disguise it under taking a break? So, as a final thoughts here, the fantasy of a break often promises a version of life without tension, but psychological life inherently involves conflict, dependency, desire, and limitation. And sometimes what we're really seeking when we're saying we need a break from the relationship or from work or from therapy is actually support in tolerating the feelings that those spaces awaken in us. And so, I hope that this has given you maybe some more understanding of like what is going on internally when we're saying, I need a break. How can we maybe get more support or lean into some of the discomfort, or where maybe actually quite wise and quite um, a respect to our autonomy, to respect our limitations, and that we can't actually continue this conversation right now without it really going haywire. And taking a break is actually the kindest thing that we can do for ourselves in the relationship, in which case, how can we communicate that in a way that will allow the space and the break to be useful? That wraps up our episode today. I hope that it was useful for you. You're welcome to let me know. You can follow me on Instagram. You can comment, you can like, subscribe, wherever you're listening to this podcast. And if you want to keep going with this conversation and talk more about shame and embarrassment and what may happen, what gets stuck when we don't resolve things that we're working through outside of ourselves, go check out my episode on embarrassment here. And I will catch you next time.